It's the third week of July. You already know what that means before you get out of bed. There's a thickness to the air in the bedroom, a weight to it. The sheet feels slightly damp at the edges. The ceiling fan pushes the same warm air in a slow, useless circle above you. And even before your feet hit the floor, you feel the familiar dull frustration of a house that never quite cools down, no matter how low you set the thermostat. You walk to the kitchen. The tile is warm. The walls are warm. Even the countertop somehow holds heat it absorbed yesterday. You look at the thermostat, 74 degrees. You set it to 68 last night. You go outside to check the unit. The compressor is running. The fan is spinning. Everything is working. But the house, the actual lived-in air of it, feels like the inside of a bread box. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you do the math you've been doing every July for the past decade. Last month's electric bill, the one before that. The slow, quiet arithmetic of a house that depends on machinery to stay livable, and machinery that somehow never quite manages it. That was the summer I started paying attention to something I had been driving past for years. There is a farmhouse about 12 miles outside of Intercourse, Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County. White clapboard siding, a deep front porch, a bank barn behind it, the big Pennsylvania kind, built into a hillside so the lower level stays in the earth. I had passed it 100 times. What I noticed, what finally stopped me, was this. It was the hottest week of the summer, mid-90s. Humid enough that the air shimmered over the asphalt. The kind of day where you don't want to stand outside for longer than it takes to walk to your car, and there was a woman sitting on that front porch, not fanning herself, not wilting, just sitting. In the shade, yes, but more than shade. She looked comfortable. The way you look in October, not July. The house had no air conditioning unit, no compressor outside, no window units, nothing. I pulled over. I'm not sure what I expected. What I got was a quiet, practical conversation about airflow, stone, earth, and a few very specific decisions made in the design of that house. Decisions that, the woman told me matter-of-factly, most people don't build that way anymore. That conversation sent me to an archive, which sent me to a library, which eventually led me to understand something about cooling that most of us, living in houses built in the last 50 years, simply never learned. The first place I looked was the Penn State Extension agricultural bulletins from the mid-20th century. These were practical documents, not academic papers, not theoretical, written for farmers and rural home builders who needed to understand how to keep animals cool, how to keep food from spoiling, how to design structures that could handle heat without mechanical intervention. What I found was not a single secret. It was a system, a layered, interlocking set of principles that had been understood and applied for generations, and that had somewhere between 1950 and 1980 quietly stopped being taught. Not because the principles stopped working, because the industry around selling mechanical cooling had become, by then, enormously profitable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with what the Amish actually do, and why it works. The first principle is one most of us were taught in school and immediately forgot. Heat doesn't just move through air, it moves through mass. Your walls, your floors, your ceiling, they absorb heat during the day and release it at night. This is called thermal mass behavior. A standard modern house, built with 2x4 framing and half-inch drywall and fiberglass insulation and vinyl siding, has very little thermal mass. It heats up fast. It cools down fast. It has almost no capacity to buffer temperature change. A traditionally built Pennsylvania farmhouse, thick stone foundation, plaster walls, wide plank floors over a full cellar, has enormous thermal mass. When the temperature outside spikes to 95 degrees, the interior walls of that house might be absorbing heat, yes, but they're absorbing it slowly. The temperature inside lags behind the temperature outside by 6, 8, sometimes 12 hours. By the time those walls would fully warm up, the sun is already setting, the night air drops, and the mass begins releasing heat outward again. The house breathes. Touch the interior wall of an old stone farmhouse on a hot afternoon. You'll notice something strange. It feels cool, not air-conditioned cool, not cold, just noticeably, unmistakably cooler than the air around it, because that wall has been buffering temperature all day. It is, in a very real sense, a thermal battery, storing coolness absorbed during the night and releasing it slowly through the heat of the afternoon. Modern construction doesn't do this. It was never designed to. The second principle is airflow architecture, specifically the stack effect. Hot air rises. Everyone knows this. But what most people don't realize is that a house can be designed to use this fact, as a passive cooling engine. Here is how it works in a traditional Amish farmhouse. The cellar or basement sits in the earth. The earth below the frost line maintains a near constant temperature, typically between 52 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the season. In Lancaster County, that means even in August, the air just below ground level is 55 degrees. The house is designed with low vents or gaps at cellar level, and high vents or operable windows at the attic level. As warm air rises and escapes through the top, it draws cool air up from below. The house becomes, in effect, a slow chimney, but running in reverse. Cool air enters at the bottom. Warm air exits at the top. This is not a new idea. Passive cooling stacks have been documented in Persian architecture dating back over 2,000 years. The Badjir, or windcatcher towers of the Iranian plateau, used exactly this principle to cool homes in regions where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees. The Romans built hypocausts, underfloor air circulation systems that used the same thermal logic in both winter and summer orientations. The Pennsylvania German settlers who built Lancaster County's farmhouses almost certainly brought this knowledge with them from Central Europe. The Amish, as a community defined by continuity with that practical past, simply never stopped applying it. Cut to attic interior of a farmhouse, a large hinged vent, morning light. The third principle is the one most people find surprising. The attic is not insulation, it is a radiator. In a modern house, the attic is sealed, insulated, and kept as separate from the living space as possible. This seems logical, but it creates a problem. An unventilated attic in July can reach 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 150 degrees of radiant heat sitting directly above your ceiling, all afternoon, every afternoon. No amount of insulation fully stops that from eventually pushing heat downward. Traditional attic design in Amish and older farmhouse construction used large gable vents, ridge vents, and sometimes a second-story overhang to exhaust that attic heat continuously. The air in the attic turned over completely every few minutes. Rather than a sealed pocket of trapped radiant heat, it became a moving column of air. The roof got hot, the air moved through and out. The ceiling below stayed comparatively cool. A 2005 Oak Ridge National Laboratory study on passive attic ventilation found that properly ventilated attic assemblies could reduce ceiling level radiant heat gain by 30 to 40% compared to sealed assemblies, without any mechanical intervention whatsoever. 30 to 40%, with nothing but air movement and design. This knowledge didn't begin in Lancaster County. Follow it backward. The Pennsylvania German settlers of the 18th century brought building traditions from the Rhine Valley and the Swiss uplands, regions with hot summers, cold winters, and an absolute requirement that buildings work without reliance on external fuel sources. Wood was scarce. Coal was not yet common. You built your house to manage its own climate, or you suffered. Go further back. Medieval English longhouses were built with a central hearth and an open ridge in the roof, not just to exhaust smoke, but to drive a constant stack effect airflow through the structure. The floor stayed cool, the walls stayed cool. The fire was the engine, but the house did the thermal work. Go further back still. Adobe construction in the American Southwest, used by Pueblo peoples for over 1,000 years, relies almost entirely on thermal mass and stack effect. The thick mud walls absorb the ferocious desert heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Pueblo interiors stay in the mid-70s during summer days that regularly hit 105 outside. Not because of magic, because of physics that those builders understood with complete, hard-won precision. What the Amish practice is not unusual. What is unusual is that the rest of us stopped. By the 1950s, residential air conditioning had become commercially viable at scale. Window units were available for under $300. Central forced air systems became a standard feature in new construction. The industry grew quickly, and the building codes, construction norms, and architectural training that followed were shaped over decades by an assumption that had never quite been stated out loud: that mechanical cooling would always be available, always be affordable, always be acceptable to maintain. The consequences of that assumption have been building quietly for 70 years. Houses stopped being designed to manage heat passively. There was no financial incentive for builders to add mass to walls. It added cost and complexity. There was no market pressure to design for attic ventilation beyond the minimum required by code. Cellars got shallower, then disappeared entirely into crawl spaces. Deep front porches, which had served as outdoor thermal buffers for centuries, were dropped from floor plans because they reduced interior square footage, which is what the per square foot price model rewarded. The knowledge of passive cooling didn't disappear because someone decided to suppress it. It disappeared because the incentives favored ignoring it. A contractor building tract houses in 1968 had no financial reason to pour an extra 8 inches of stone into a foundation. An HVAC company had no financial reason to publish research on how to reduce dependence on HVAC. A real estate market that priced homes by square footage had no mechanism to reward a cooler, more livable house that cost slightly more to build thoughtfully. The economic logic pointed one direction, the knowledge drifted the other. And so, within about 2 generations, practical cooling intelligence, the kind that had been a basic literacy of rural home building for centuries, became something only certain communities still preserved. Communities that, by deliberate choice, never adopted the assumption that power was infinite, cheap, and reliable. Here is what is remarkable about all of this. You don't need to tear your house down and rebuild it in stone. The principles apply at every scale. Some of them can be implemented this weekend. The earth tube/ground coupled ventilation. This is the most dramatic of the techniques, and also the most involved, but it is far simpler than it sounds. The concept, buried tubing runs from outside the house several feet underground and enters the basement or lower level. Incoming air, regardless of outdoor temperature, travels through 20 to 40 feet of earth-buried pipe where it equilibrates toward the ground's constant 55-degree temperature before entering the living space. Specifications for a basic residential earth tube system: 6-inch diameter perforated agricultural drain tile or smooth HDPE pipe buried at a minimum depth of 4 feet. 6 feet is more effective, length of 25 to 40 feet of run entry point into the lowest level of the house. With a simple manual damper for winter control, screen both ends against insects and rodents. Materials cost for a basic single-run system, approximately $150 to $350 in materials depending on region. A 1982 USDA technical note on passive cooling for rural structures documented earth tube systems in Missouri and Kansas farmhouses reducing peak summer indoor temperatures by 8 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit compared to adjacent conventionally ventilated structures. Limitations to be honest about. In very humid climates, earth tubes can introduce moisture if not properly drained and screened. They work best in the arid Midwest and Mid-Atlantic regions. In the humid South, a drain at the tube's lowest point and appropriate screening is essential. Nighttime thermal flushing, this requires nothing. No materials, no cost, just understanding. The principle: most nights in summer, even after very hot days, outdoor temperatures drop significantly between midnight and 5 in the morning. In much of the continental United States, nighttime summer lows are 15 to 25 degrees cooler than daytime highs. Traditional practice: open the house wide during that window, every cross ventilation path available. Then close the house completely, windows, doors, shades, before the outdoor temperature climbs past indoor temperature in the morning. The house becomes a cool air capacitor. It holds the night's coolness through the afternoon. Modern insulated construction actually works in your favor here. It holds the cool flush temperature longer than older, leakier construction did. The Amish don't call this a system. They call it sense. Exterior shade, the forgotten variable. A Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory study on residential heat gain found that exterior shading, specifically deciduous trees or roll-up external blinds on south and west-facing windows, reduced solar heat gain through glass by 60 to 70% compared to interior curtains. Interior curtains, which most people use, stop heat after it has already entered the glass envelope of the house. Exterior shading stops it before. Traditional farmhouse construction addressed this with deep roof overhangs, typically 16 to 24 inches, which shaded south-facing windows at high summer sun angles, while allowing lower winter sun to enter for passive heating. A simple retrofit: exterior roll shades on west-facing windows. Install them before 3 p.m. on hot days. The difference in room temperature by evening is not subtle. It is, in most cases, immediately noticeable. Cost $30 to $80 per window for basic exterior roll shades. Thermal mass augmentation. If you cannot rebuild your walls, you can add mass in other ways. Water has one of the highest heat capacities of any common substance, approximately 4 times higher than stone and dramatically higher than drywall. Large sealed water containers, the kind used for emergency water storage, food grade, dark colored, placed in a room absorb heat during the day and release it at night. A standard 55-gallon drum filled with water provides roughly the equivalent thermal buffer of several hundred pounds of concrete. Placed on a south-facing wall in a room that tends to overheat, a modest arrangement of dark water containers, even 40 to 60-gallon units, can measurably reduce peak afternoon temperature swings. This is not glamorous. It is not something anyone will sell you in a home improvement store, but it is real physics applied with common materials. There is something else worth sitting with here. Your grandfather, or his father before him, understood most of this without being taught it formally, not because people were smarter then, but because the relationship between a person and their home was different. You built a house knowing you would live in it for the rest of your life, possibly that your children would live in it after you. The performance of that house, its coolness in summer, its warmth in winter, its ability to shelter without demanding constant input, was your direct, daily concern. You understood which direction the prevailing summer wind came from. You knew which rooms got afternoon sun. You knew that the cellar stayed cool because the earth did, and you designed around that fact the way you designed around the contour of the land. Practical capability of that kind used to be entirely ordinary. A man who built a house was expected to understand how air moved through it. A woman who managed a farmhouse through July was expected to know which windows to open at which hours, which rooms to close off during the heat of the day, where to store food so it stayed cool without a refrigerator. This was not extraordinary knowledge. It was baseline knowledge. The kind of thing a person was simply expected to carry. Somewhere in the last 2 or 3 generations, that knowledge became something specialists held. HVAC engineers, building scientists, passive house consultants charging $200 an hour, not because the knowledge became complicated, because the assumption that someone else would manage it, the utility company, the appliance manufacturer, the service technician, made it seem unnecessary to carry yourself. The Amish never made that assumption, not because they were contrarian, not because they were backward, but because their communities had, by deliberate philosophical choice, maintained the principle that a family should understand and manage the systems they depend on. That dependence, unexamined, invisible dependence, was itself a kind of poverty. That position turns out to have been more practically sophisticated than it first appeared. There is no villain in the story. No one sat in a boardroom and decided that Americans should forget how to cool their houses passively. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more difficult to be at peace with. An industry grew around a solution. The solution worked, imperfectly, expensively, but it worked well enough to sell. New homes were designed around the assumption that the solution would always be available. Old knowledge, the kind that required no product, no subscription, no service call, became economically invisible. It didn't generate revenue, so no one taught it, no one marketed it. No continuing education program for contractors included it. And 3 generations later, we are in the position of paying every month for a mechanical substitute for knowledge that was once simply part of how a person understood the world they lived in. The discomfort isn't anger, exactly. It's the quiet awareness of a dependency you didn't choose and weren't told you were entering. It's the realization that the house you're paying to cool could, with some modifications and a different relationship to how heat and air actually move, need far less cooling in the first place. Not none, not zero, but far less. And the gap between what it needs and what it uses, that gap is not a technical problem. It is a knowledge problem. Cooling is only one piece of it. There is a related body of knowledge, equally practical, equally forgotten, about how traditional builders managed moisture. Not humidity control in the modern sense, with dehumidifiers and vapor barriers, but the way old structures breathe moisture in and out seasonally, using the natural movement of air through walls to prevent the mold and rot that now cost homeowners tens of thousands of dollars to remediate. There is the question of water, specifically the way rural communities for centuries managed rainwater, not to dispose of it, but to slow it, to store it, to recognize that an inch of rain falling on a half-acre roof is an enormous quantity of usable resource, that modern infrastructure is designed to move away from you as fast as possible. There is the question of food preservation, the root cellar specifically, which is not a primitive refrigerator but an engineered microclimate that exploits the same 55-degree earth temperature principle to maintain a narrow humidity and temperature band ideal for long-term storage of root vegetables, fermented goods, and preserved foods. A well-designed root cellar, built correctly, outperforms a modern refrigerator for certain foods over timescales of months, not in every condition, but in the right conditions, in ways that modern food science still hasn't fully quantified. All of it connected, all of it practical, all of it built on the same quiet principle that the physical world has patterns, and that if you understand the patterns, you can work with them instead of against them. People knew this once, some still do. The question isn't whether the knowledge is recoverable. The question is whether we're willing to sit still long enough to learn it again.